Something to Chew On is a podcast devoted to the exploration and discussion of global food systems. It's produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University. I'm Jay Weeks, PhD candidate in the Department of Agronomy. My co-host is Scott Sonoda, an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy who specializes in the philosophy of science.
Hi everybody, welcome back. Today's guest is Dr. Harry Klee. Harry is an eminent scholar and professor in horticultural sciences working to understand the chemical and genetic makeup of flavor in fruits and vegetables. His career began in Monsanto in the mid-'80s, where he helped to develop the techniques that launched genetically engineered crops into agriculture. In 1995, he was offered an endowed position at the University of Florida, working to develop better varieties for the state's tomato industry through traditional breeding techniques, and he remains there still today. In 2009, Harry was elected a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and 3 years later, in 2012, he was inducted into the National Academy of Sciences. Scott, Jon, and I had a lot of fun talking with Harry. We cover a wide range of topics, including traditional plant breeding, genetic modification and gene editing, why tomatoes in the supermarket often don't taste very good, how Harry's lab is identifying compounds that are important to producing better-tasting tomatoes, and what it's like to be a scientist in industry, along with many, many other things. Hope you enjoy.
Dr. Harry Klee, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we'll have introduced you a little bit in the intro to the podcast here, but tell us in your own words a little bit about yourself. How did you get to where you are today?
How did I get here? Actually, I started my bachelor's degrees in psychology, and I very quickly decided that psychology was a field that I didn't want to be in. It intrigued me. I got into science because I worked in a mental hospital for my summer internships, and I saw the remarkable things that could happen to people who were crazy when you gave them drugs. And I started to say, maybe behavior is all about drugs. I need to know more about biochemistry. So then I got into biochemistry and got from there into microbiology, and from there into plant biology. And here I am working on tomatoes.
So did you start taking microbiology courses and biochemistry courses as an undergrad, or is it something you knew when you graduated you wanted to pursue in graduate school?
Actually, I did not take any microbiology as an undergraduate. I looked at it as a major, and the university said, you can't take any microbiology courses, even if you're a major, until you're a junior. And I said, well, that's crazy. What do I want to go all the way to my third year before I even find out if I like this or not? So no, I took chemistry and a little bit of biochemistry as an undergraduate, but no microbiology.
So then you went on to graduate school right out of undergrad then?
Yes, yes, straight into a biochemistry PhD program.
And what'd you do there?
Actually, my first project was working on frogs. We actually went out and in the summertime we'd go out and capture bullfrogs in the ponds, and we'd bring them back to the lab and cut out their livers. And I decided that was not for me. I did not want to work on anything involving killing animals. So at that point I switched, and the last part of my PhD actually was working on bacteria, E. coli.
So from there, how'd you work your way into the plant sector then?
So at the time that I was finishing my PhD was a very exciting time for plant biology, because people had just discovered this organism, this bacterium, Agrobacterium tumefaciens, actually took a piece of its DNA and put it into plant cells. And I thought, oh my God, this is this burgeoning new field that we were just calling biotechnology was something that really intrigued me. And I thought that, wow, if I could understand how this organism worked, we could use it to genetically engineer plants, and that would be the coolest thing ever. And so I went and did my postdoc on Agrobacterium, and that turned out to be the foundation for my career, and then led me from there to Monsanto, where I worked for a decade for them.
So, I mean, that must have been a fascinating time to be starting in science. So, why is agrobacterium so important? Like, what's happening there to allow us to do the biotechnological transformations?
Well, agrobacterium is what we would call today a plant pathogen. It makes tumors in trees. It's a real problem in the orchard industry, for example. And people didn't know how it worked. And literally the year before I got to the lab, a good friend of mine, Mike Tomashow, figured out that it took a piece of its DNA and transferred it into the plant, where it incorporated into the plant, became part of the plant DNA. And it stayed there and caused these tumors. And people said, well, if we could understand how it makes the tumors and get rid of the genes that make the tumors, but just leave the part that makes the DNA get transferred and incorporated in, you could put anything you wanted in between the ends of this DNA and get it into the plant.
Right, from pathogen to vector.
Yeah. And so we said, oh, this is the key to being able to it just breaks. Well, we turn interkingdom DNA transfer, from bacteria into a plant, and we thought nothing else can do this. This is remarkable, and if we understood this, we could harness that power to introduce things, which, for example, genes that confer resistance to insects or herbicides. And so I thought, this is a field that I just have to get into. And we still didn't know how to truly harness it when I started my postdoc. We were figuring out the rules. How does the bacterium work? What's required for that DNA transfer? And that was my postdoctoral research. And when I finished up and it was time to get a job, I can remember I interviewed for several academic positions, and I interviewed at Monsanto, and literally at Monsanto, they had just made the first transgenic plants, literally like a month before I interviewed there.
Wow.
And I went there, and I interviewed, and I was just blown away by what they wanted to do and how dedicated they were and how focused they were on improving agriculture and helping farmers. And it's funny because I got a job offer from the University of Illinois in microbiology, and I told the chairman, I said, no, I think I'm going to come to Monsanto. And he said, you're going to what?
What?
And he says, well, you should come back and do a second interview. I said, I don't need to do a second interview. This is what I want to do.
Let me convince you of the error of your ways.
And so I went to Monsanto and got involved in the earliest stages of what I would consider the second green revolution. We were a dedicated group of people, and I know everybody today likes to bash Monsanto, but I can say firsthand, these were and still are truly dedicated people who were trying their best to make agriculture better, and I was involved. And it's kind of fun as you fly across the Midwest in an airplane, you can look out the window and say, oh, yeah, I did that.
Yeah, exactly.
And there aren't very many people who can say that.
Sure. Yeah.
That's true. That's very true. I'm a cereal biochemist, and we fight the hexaploid nature of the plant. Are there limits? Is that bacterium efficient in such a polyploidic?
Yes.
Ah.
Yes. You can. There's still. It's more of an art form to transform certain plants. I think that people are more using for some of the monocots, which agrobacterium doesn't infect very well. It still can be easier to use other techniques like the particle gun, where you bombard the tissues with free DNA.
Right.
But agrobacterium works quite well, for example, in maize. We transform, we can transform canola, which is a tetraploid. Basically the limiting step is is merely can you take tissue and regenerate it into a whole plant?
Right.
And that's still hard with some crops, but
Yes.
yeah, agrobacterium works great.
And for you U.S. types, maize is what a lot of people would call corn, although that's not the universal.
So when you have the transformed tissue and you need to bring it to a whole crop, what needs to happen there?
Basically, the system, you introduce DNA into single cells. And what you need is the ability to take that single cell that you've introduced the DNA and regenerate a whole plant. For some plants, that's really easy. The first plants that were transformed were things like tobacco, petunia, trivial. The tissue culture for tobacco was worked out a century ago. And it's easy to take a single cell and regenerate a whole plant from. In other plants, it's much harder. Maize was probably 10 years behind tobacco, for example. It was just harder to work with.
What makes them so much different?
Their response to the plant hormones. We use tricks with hormones to, you take a single cell typically, and you grow it as a callus on artificial media, and then what you do is you trick it into making shoots by applying a hormone we call cytokinin. And so suddenly that mass of cells will start to form an organized shoot that comes up on and starts to grow and looks more like a plant. And then after that, you can cut off that shoot from the callus and stick it on a different medium, which forces it to make roots. And again, this kind of technology has been worked out in some species for many years. A lot of plants are micropropagated. That's the way that orchids, for example, are micropropagated. You can make billions of orchids that are absolutely identical through tissue culture. So it just depends on the species.
And these hormones are naturally produced anyway, right? I mean, the plants our plants are using these in the environment.
Absolutely. And to come full circle, the way that agrobacterium makes tumors is it actually has genes that cause the plant to make auxins and cytokinins. Mm-hmm. And that's how it tricks the plant into growing these tumors, which are the home for the bacteria.
In a cereal that's basically living but very slowly living, you'll have hormones that are produced and released under specific stimulation that will go into the seed itself and cause it to start turning itself on and starting to germinate.
Yeah. All plants make these hormones.
So you're no longer with Monsanto.
Nope.
After Monsanto, you came back to academia, right?
I did.
So
I did.
How did that happen? What made you decide to come back?
I guess a couple of things. The first thing was that we actually developed products, and you might think, being in a company, once you develop some products, that would give you some freedom to do more exciting things. Well, that's not the way it works. The closer you get to products, the more focus there is on making more products. And so it became very product oriented. When I first went there, everything we did was basic science. It was discovery research, and we were publishing papers in the best journals. We published papers in Science and Nature, which are the top level publications. Everything we did was discovery. We had to figure out everything there was about what we now call plant molecular biology. But after we figured out how to do this stuff, it became more of what can we do to make products. And also, success in a company basically means that you move up in the bureaucracy and you become more of a manager rather than a scientist. And so I said, running a big group is not what I want to be. I want to be a scientist. I want to keep my hands in the science. And I was very lucky. I was offered an endowed chair at the University of Florida in 1995, and they said, "We love what you're doing. We want you to work on tomatoes, and whatever you want to do is fine with us." And I said, "That sounds great. I'll be there."
Sounds like a mandate. Yeah. I spent some time in industry as well, and I wonder, the company that I worked for had a dual track system, and you could choose whether you wanted to rise up the ladder that was scientific versus non-scientific. Did you have that option?
Yes.
Okay.
Monsanto had what they called a fellows program. And you could be a science fellow or you could be a manager. And in theory, on paper, those were two equal parallel tracks. In practice, though, the fellows were not given the same respect as the managers. If you had 25 people working for you and a big budget, it was worth a whole lot more than some publications and a couple of technicians.
Yeah, or a patent here and there.
Yeah.
So you started working on tomatoes.
Mm-hmm.
So why tomatoes? Well, what's the problem, and what were you trying to solve, or what are you trying to solve?
So tomato was the number one vegetable crop in Florida when I moved there. It still sort of is. So it's a very, very important to Florida's agriculture. I work at a land-grant university. Our mission is to help the agriculture in the state of Florida. And so it made perfect sense to work on tomatoes. And when I looked around, I said, well, what's the biggest problem with tomatoes? And the biggest problem was flavor. In fact, there's a great article that I still have. It was published in the New Yorker, I think, in 1987 or something like that, that basically talks about how all of the commercial tomatoes look great, but they're hard as a rock and they taste like cardboard.
Could you say something about how we got there?
Yeah. So that was the first question I said. How could you have done this?
Yes, right. It's a travesty.
And in fact, there was another book that was published a few years ago. I'm trying to remember what the name of it is. Oh, Tomatoland. This guy published a book called Tomatoland, and he talks about what motivated him to write the book was he was riding on the interstate highway in Florida, and there was a truck full of tomatoes in front of him, and one of them bounced out of the truck, bounced off the road, and hit his windshield and cracked it.
Oh, no.
And
tomatoes shouldn't do that.
and so you look at that and you say, how did this happen? And I guess I'm giving away the punchlines of some of my seminar that I'm going to give later today here. But the reason is actually fairly simple, and that is that the growers are not paid for flavor. The growers are paid for how many pounds of red objects they put in a box. And flavor is not something that they're paid for. In fact, if you talk to them, they'll say, not only am I not paid for it, but if I had a tomato that tasted really good, the wholesaler is going to take the box of tomatoes, put them in the refrigerator, and it's going to ruin the flavor. So not only am I not being paid for it, if I had it, someone else downstream would probably screw it up.
The system won't keep it, right? Yeah.
And so if you look at it, the supply chain, it's very difficult to produce high-quality tomatoes at one end and get them to the consumer at a reasonable price at the other end. It's very difficult. And so that most growers, in fact, today, this is not true when I first moved to Florida, but today, the majority of tomatoes grown in the field in Florida don't go to the consumer. They go to the food service industry. And the only thing that McDonald's or Subway care about, well, McDonald's in particular, they want it to be round. They want it to be about the same diameter as a hamburger bun. And they want to be able to make 8 uniform slices that don't drip all over you and just sit there and look pretty on top of your hamburger. And so the majority of tomatoes in Florida today go to the food service industry. In fact, the majority of tomatoes that are now in commercial production that go to consumers come from either Mexico or Canada. You can get a better tomato out of a greenhouse in Canada than you can in a field out of Florida.
Have you seen those greenhouse facilities in Canada? They're quite incredible.
They're amazing.
Truly.
They've got it down. They're producing large numbers of fruits. They pick them when they're fully ripe, as opposed to Florida, where they're picking them when they're still green. And so the whole system is set up to not reward the grower for producing quality.
So how much of that has changed? We'll get into the science, but I wonder how much what were the cultural forces that have shifted this, and how much of that was maybe actually due to the scientific developments too, like giving people a image of new possibilities?
I would say almost nothing to do with the science. Yeah. It's all really based on economics. Yeah. The growers in those greenhouses and the growers in Mexico can produce a cheaper product. And to some extent, the consumers have recognized that the Florida field tomato does not taste that good. And so there has been this shift towards vine-ripe tomatoes, which honestly don't taste a whole lot better, but taste a little bit better. There's been all of these new niche markets now. You see cherry tomatoes, grape tomatoes, which have a lot more flavor than do the big ones.
Sugar, yeah.
You see the tomatoes like the Campari tomato, which is much smaller, sells at a premium. You're talking $3 a pound maybe versus $1 a pound for a field-grown tomato. More people are willing to pay for that because they know they'll get a quality. The Campari has very specific requirements. It has to be picked when it's ripe. It has to be shipped quickly. It can't be refrigerated. And people do recognize that. Unfortunately, though, most people still buy on price. I would say that 20% of the population will maybe shop at a Whole Foods. I don't shop at Whole Foods. I think they charge outrageous amounts of money, and I'm not going to pay it. But some people will shop at places like that. There's been much more growth in farmers markets, but that's seasonal. Right. On a year-round basis, there's kind of this dichotomy. Everybody would like to eat like Alice Waters, and eat only what's seasonal and what's local, but the reality is most people don't want to do that. Right. Most people want their tomato 12 months of the year. Right. They want their cantaloupe 12 months of the year, and we pay the price for that. Right. And the price is that you have an emphasis on shippability rather than flavor. Mm-hmm. But so I think still 80% of the population buys on cost, not quality, and then they complain about the quality.
Right. So for me, tomatoes are one of these things that I pretty much only eat in season, except for the small ones, because those ones year round, those are not bad, right? But there's no point in buying a tomato in the store in the winter, right?
It's not going to taste very good.
So what's your plan to change that, or what are you guys doing to make improvements so that the tomato not only tastes better but also is economically viable for the farmer?
Well, so what we've done is to focus on, first of all, what is the genetics of flavor? What's gone wrong with the modern tomato? Why does it taste that way? Some of it is production, but a lot of it is the genetics just are inferior. As if you don't select for something, you will essentially select against it. And so tomato flavor is extremely complex. We've identified dozens of genes that affect flavor, and the growers basically have completely ignored them. And the breeders have ignored it, and so what happens is you've got 2 copies of every gene, unless you're in a hexaploid, but you got 2 copies of every gene. You could have a good copy and a bad copy, and if you don't select for it randomly, you stand a chance of getting the good one as the bad one. Well, what's happened is that we've ended up with modern tomatoes. If you look at the whole spectrum of the genetics of tomatoes, modern tomatoes are one tiny, tiny sliver of them. They've been highly inbred. Breeders have taken each other's varieties and exchanged them either willingly or unwillingly. Very, very narrow genetics. And what's happened is that a lot of the desirable alleles of genes, the copies that have the better properties, have been lost. And so you end up with a tomato that basically is genetically inferior in terms of flavor.
How different is the tomato in this sense of having lost a lot of this genetic diversity versus others? I mean, because the same story is true for a lot of agricultural projects, right?
I would argue that any crop that has been intensively bred, if you look at nutrition or flavor quality, it has deteriorated. I can go down the list. I can say strawberries are another classic example where people have bred for very large fruit with very little flavor. Basically, all they've done is to increase yield is add water. And that's what we've done with tomatoes. We've just added water. You just diluted out the flavor chemicals with more water, and that translates into yield. You can look at, there's some studies with grains that if you look at micronutrient contents of some grains, you can find that the modern varieties have less than the older varieties. So it's not just tomatoes. It's any intensively bred crop.
And as a precursor to doing all the flavor biochemistry, did you actually go in and have to use sensory techniques to identify what the flavor was?
Yes.
In that way?
Yes, absolutely. So,
and did you do that in-house, or did you go out to someone?
We collaborate with a group in food science, and so we have done consumer panels in our food science department. We've anybody who's done these kinds of things can appreciate how much work this is. We've tested 160 different varieties of tomatoes over probably a decade now. And just think of the logistics of getting enough ripe fruit at the same stage to give to 100 consumers on one day. It's been a large amount of work, but basically what we've done, I apologize if anybody's going to attend my seminar today, because you're going to know the answers.
If a lot of people listening to this won't
not
made
right.
it to the seminar.
And
so.
worth hearing twice.
But the reality is what we've done is we take lots of varieties. We've covered the gamut from old heirloom varieties to wild accessions to the most modern, highly inbred varieties. We give them to our consumers. We take samples back to the lab. We grind them up. We measure 68 different potentially associated chemicals. We then go back and say, which ones did you like? Which ones did you not like? And
Which tomato in this case?
Yes. And so you end up with a giant statistical puzzle. Which chemicals are correlated with liking and which ones aren't?
So I have so many questions about this, but sort of two of them quickly. One of them is, how do you control for so many of those other factors, right? Because these tomatoes all grow in different ways, right? So they're going to be sensitive, to their growth environments differently, right? So
yeah, that's a very complicated answer. But so what we've tried to do is we embrace the diversity. Okay. As long as we're measuring what's in it on the day that we harvested, and the consumers are telling us how much they like on the day that we harvested it, it doesn't matter.
So the point isn't so much which varietal of tomato, right, or
Yes.
which heirloom. It's sort of what are the chemicals, and so then it doesn't matter as much. Yeah.
That's exactly correct.
Yeah.
So
you can ask a question that would be very sensitive to that,
Right,
but it's
right.
not that
Yes.
question.
Not this one.
So the first question is simply, which chemicals drive people to like those tomatoes? Right. The second question is more complicated, and that is, what is the underlying genetics? Mm-hmm. And that's where the environment plays a huge role. Mm-hmm. And so we have ways to deal with that. The best way we deal with it is we always have what we call a check variety out in the field. We've grown it every season, and we put it through our consumer panels every season. Okay. So whether we've had a dry year or a wet year or a cold year, we can always correlate everything back to that one variety that's always present. That's the best way that we have to control the genetics, the environmental influence on the genetics. But that's the extremely difficult part. And honestly, it was easier to figure out what the chemistry of flavor was than it was to figure out the genetics of flavor.
Right. So how much you're looking at the like a lot of these are volatiles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of how much does texture play a role in other factors in people's reactions, and how much has that complicated that part of the story?
It does complicate things quite a bit, actually. Well, not quite a bit. What I'll tell you is it's kind of funny. So we've used our statistical models to say, can we develop a prediction software where we can just grind up a sample and predict how much people will like it without having to do the consumer panel? And what we found is that about roughly 85% of the time we could do a perfect correlation based on the chemistry. Breeder, if you're a breeder, 85%, it's like, wow.
Yeah.
We started to think about, well, what's wrong with the other 15%?
What's different with the other 15%?
And it turns out that in most cases, you go back and you find that they're, for the most part, they're just really mushy. Mealy is the term we use. And there are texture problems, and they stand out like a sore thumb. The chemistry, when we look at the chemistry, and say, people should really like this. What is this? And then it's like, I don't know if you've ever grown heirloom tomatoes, but there are a few like, Brandywine's a great example of it. Brandywine is one that if you pick it off the vine and then when it's perfectly ripe and you bring it in your house and eat it right away, it's delicious.
Yeah, right.
You let it sit on the kitchen counter for 24 hours and it gets mushy, and they're terrible.
Yeah, right.
And so that's what we would find. We would find that texture did have an influence. If it was, so the way I like to phrase it is, texture can kill the flavor. Mm-hmm. It's, in most tomatoes, they're within a range that it doesn't make much difference. But if they are way too firm or way too soft, it's just kills it, and they're awful.
So you've used the term heirloom a few times, and I know that's becoming more and more popular. You see it on restaurant menus and all that kind of stuff. That using heirloom tomatoes. What does that mean?
Yeah. So my cynical definition of heirloom is it's a variety that farmers decided decades ago wasn't worth growing anymore. It's basically, I think, I would define an heirloom as, first of all, it's something that breeds true, so it's not a hybrid. It's old, and it may or may not taste good. And in fact, we've screened hundreds of heirlooms. Besides the 160, we've tasted probably 500 different varieties. Some heirlooms are awful. I mean, just because it's old doesn't mean it's good.
True.
But so there is no legal definition of an heirloom. But basically, in general, I would say that I would consider heirlooms to be something that's, let's say, pre-World War II, self-pollinated, so you can save seeds. And at some point, someone thought it had some properties that were desirable. And that's about it. That's the definition.
Sure. Yeah, it's become kind of trendy to put on menus.
Yeah, it's a misnomer.
Like the way it sounds, right?
Well, but on the other hand, right, there was something that's lost, right? So in fact, right, sort of a lot of the better tasting tomatoes, right, are heirlooms.
Yeah, but they're terrible to grow.
Right.
I mean, this is the thing: is that most of the heirloom tomatoes, nobody grows them anymore commercially because they're terrible to grow.
So why low yields?
Low yields,
Pest issues,
no disease resistance.
Don't survive the harvest process in some cases.
Yeah, very soft. They just wouldn't cut it today. About the only way that you can grow them is if you're selling them at a farmer's market and you're going to get $6 a pound. And even then it can be challenging.
Yeah, this isn't a phenomenon only for tomatoes. Certainly ancient grains is an example of the same sort of thing, the progenitors of modern day Triticum aestivum wheat.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why we've ended up with the varieties we have now that don't have any flavor, right? Because they were selecting away from the poorer properties of these older varieties.
Right. So what we've actually tried to do is to capture that and turn it to our advantage. So one of the things that we've done, we say, well, okay, the commercial tomato market is challenging. We know how to improve flavor. We need to do that in a package that delivers all of the performance the growers want. But there is an audience out there that's much more receptive, and that's the home gardener. Mm-hmm. And so what we've done is we've taken that knowledge of the heirloom tomatoes, and again, we've screened hundreds of these. We say, well, okay, what happens if I take the very best tasting ones, and I cross those to a modern, disease-resistant, high-yielding, firm variety? what does the hybrid look like? And so we've done that. We've done it with dozens of them. And in a few cases, we've identified lines, hybrids that have all of the flavor of the heirloom parent and 5 times the yield of them. And so we've gotten a few varieties that are just magical, really, really good. And so we're working with seed companies now. They're trying several of them. The first 2 actually were just commercialized this year.
Congratulations.
Yeah, it's exciting. But the home gardeners love us. We actually started a program. We got so many doing things like this interview. We got so many requests for these things that we decided, why don't we set up a system where people can donate to the research and we'll send them seeds. So we've actually done that. We've sent out, I think we're up to over 12,000 people now we've sent seeds to.
Wow. And what do you ask from them, or is this totally
one
direction?
We've asked for a donation of $10 because that's the minimum the university will process on a credit card.
Yeah. I was thinking more in terms of, tell me any problems you had with it. Tell me the weather is related to what you felt.
Well, so this is where we're going, and the reality is we've gotten some real dedicated home gardeners have given us immense feedback, and it's been really useful. They tell us how our varieties do across the country. We've sent them now to all 50 states and 40 countries, and we're getting feedback from people. And so actually, we have just decided to do this in a more formal way. And what we're going to do is to start to use unreleased varieties, and people will agree. They'll have to agree to get them that they will provide us with feedback. We recognize that not everybody will do that, but we think we'll get enough. We're going to set up an online system where they can report when they planted them, when they harvested their first fruit, any disease problems. And what we're going to do is I'm going to have someone in the lab, my technician is going to, if they have problems like with diseases, send us pictures and we'll help you diagnose it. If we can't diagnose it, we'll hook you up with your closest extension agent. We want to formalize this in kind of a citizen science kind of.
Yeah, this is very much what if you read some of the older documents related to the Extension Service, this was the sort of populist ideal that they had of including as many people as they possibly could in the process. Yeah. So congratulations.
Oh, I think it's going to be really fun. It's going to be a lot of work, and I can tell you, usually from September through November, I'm getting at least probably 5 emails a week where people will send me detailed descriptions of what they have done over the season and how well my tomatoes have done. And, they'll either say, love this one, didn't like this one at all. But it all comes together and helps us in order to do the next generation.
Do you ever get sick of tomatoes?
It's funny. I actually don't eat practically any fresh tomatoes anymore. The problem is that you have to eat these things unadulterated in order to rate them.
Right.
And, you can't even add salt.
True.
And I'm really no longer a big fan of fresh tomatoes, but I eat a lot of processed tomato products. Our freezer at home is full of tomato sauce, which we eat all winter.
Now, is there a possibility, and I'm sort of looping around with the interaction between the food industry and this sort of research, I can see a food company that produces a huge amount of tomato sauce wanting a flavor company to be able to compound a fresh tomato flavor that they could put into this as an ingredient. Do you see that as feasible or possible or likely?
So it's kind of funny. So I'll digress just a tiny bit and tell you that the way the citrus industry works, they harvest the oranges, they squash them and extract the juice, and then they heat them up very quickly, and all of the flavor volatiles are driven off. They actually collect the flavor volatiles and they add them back. And that's routinely done with orange juice. I have visited some of these big processing places in California, and I say, well, you're not doing that. And they say,
For tomatoes.
No, for tomatoes. They say, no, we don't do that. I say, why not? And they say, the object here is to drive off water as quickly as possible and concentrate the product down. They said, if we want flavor, we're going to add basil or oregano.
Yes.
And so they don't do that. And I am baffled as to why they don't do that. They do not collect those volatiles. The citrus industry is a paradigm that says you could do that, you could add them back. Now, I've seen a lot of recipes for home gardeners where actually there's a famous guy, actually you should get him for your podcast if you ever can, Harold McGee. He wrote a book on the science of cooking. And he actually published a recipe in the New York Times in which he adds back leaves at the very end, because the leaves produce some of the same volatiles that the fruit do, and it adds back flavor. The way that I do it is we just hold back some of our tomatoes. So we will typically, like my wife and I will roast the tomatoes to drive off a lot of the water, put them in the blender and make the sauce, and then we'll add in some that haven't been treated in any way at the end to give us that fresh flavor. And that works great. It makes a huge difference.
And certainly the hop breeders will breed some hops where they want volatile hops, and others they want clarity, and others they want bitter, and they'll put them in at different times in the process.
It's very similar to making craft beers. You add the hops again at the very end, and it changes the whole complexion.
So you're doing this through traditional breeding methods, right? Hybridization, right?
Yes.
But you come from a genetic engineering background, so tell us about that.
Yeah, so the tragedy is that we probably just can't afford to do the regulatory packages to do this by GMO. I always tell people, you want a great tasting tomato? I could have given it to you 5 years ago with GMOs. We know the pathways, we know the genes, I know how to manipulate those genes. We've actually done a lot of it experimentally. We do test GMOs in some of our consumer panels to validate some of the work that we've done on the predictions. But we're not going to sell those things. And I think number one is the cost. Number two, a lot of the same people who are so fanatical about flavor are the ones that are most anti-GMO. So I say, hey, you don't want your damn GMOs, then eat your crappy tomatoes. It makes no sense, but no, we're not doing that. Now we are thinking quite heavily about gene editing, because gene editing, at least today in the U.S., it will not be considered GMO. There are some things. The problem with gene editing is at this point we're really good at taking away stuff. We're not so good at replacing. So that's still a problem.
But gene editing, you're talking about CRISPR technology and things like that, right? So a little bit about that for the listeners who may not be familiar with what that is and what gene editing is and how that's different than.
So gene editing has the potential to really transform plant breeding. We do use gene editing, not in anything that we've released as a variety, but we use gene editing as a tool. We can go in and we can knock genes out. We can make mutations, and in most cases we're making mutations in genes that have already been mutated by nature. We're just reproducing what nature has already done. The advantage is we can go in and do it very quickly and very precisely. I'll give you a good example. There's a mutation that knocks out the conversion of lycopene to beta-carotene in tomato. That results in a deep red color tomato. They're beautiful. People love them. It's a natural mutation that knocks out this gene, and it's widely used in the industry to give you a deep red tomato. So we know the mutation. We know, and so I could take, for example, an heirloom tomato, and I could knock out the same gene with gene editing, with CRISPR, and make it high lycopene. So it's exactly equivalent to what I could do by traditional breeding, but I can do it in 6 months instead of several years of back crossing and fixing all the rest of it. So we are using that technology, and we're if the public, I mean, I think we're still in that stage where we don't know what's going to happen, but it would speed up tremendously improving varieties if we use that. And I'm enthusiastic about it. The government says that it's not going to be regulated as long as we're doing something that exists in nature.
So I've listened to Rob Fraley from Monsanto give talks about how GMO was rolled out to the public, and he, if I remember correctly, he basically said that he wishes they could do it over again because
Sure.
it would be perceived differently. What do you think is important about gene editing and how it's conveyed to people who aren't familiar with these types of methods, so that we don't end up with the same situation that we have with GMO?
So as Rob would have told you, the first thing that we did wrong when we were at Monsanto was we focused on producer traits. We focused on things that were really important to the farmer, and the consumer didn't see the benefits. We as a society have done a very, very poor job of educating the public about science and about things like risks. How many times have you heard that, oh, I don't want to fly someplace, I'd rather drive?
Right.
When you know that statistically it's far safer to fly. We have not done a good job of explaining it, and so the consumer says, why should I take this risk, even if it's minimal, when I don't see a benefit directly? The problem is most people don't have any idea where their food comes from. They don't understand that that the BT gene introduced into corn to fight off insects is safer than spraying it with tons of pesticides. They say, oh, it's GMO, that's bad. Well, we've been really poor at doing that. I think with CRISPR and genome editing, we have to be careful to make the case that this is identical. We're not doing anything that nature couldn't do itself. So no fish genes into tomatoes, even though that was never actually done. We're doing things within the species. We're not introducing anything new that couldn't be done by nature itself. And I think the first things we have to do are things that the consumers will want. And that's why actually I've been approached by a lot of people about, can you make a tomato that tastes better, that's genome edited, so we can get out there and show that this is something the consumer will really like. And I think that's important.
So the bit about that you've said several times, look, we're not going to do anything different than what has already been done in nature. We're just reproducing mutation. How important do you think that difference is between sort of, bringing something cross species or something like that? Is that so? It's important to the consumer and the public, right? Because they see it different.
Yes. I don't think.
Do you think there are any different risks, right? That happens, like sort of, that when you do bring in genes that have not traditionally been right in the population?
Well, I do think we have to be careful in everything. You can make some pretty nasty stuff with traditional breeding.
Sure, indeed, and we have.
And there are some good examples of traditionally bred crops that have produced unexpected consequences.
Right.
But people don't hear about that.
So
people don't know about that.
Give some examples.
Oh, there's. I'm trying to remember.
Got you on the spot.
Yeah, you do. I'm trying to remember. Is it celery was the one of the classic ones where they had the high levels of a compound that caused a reaction in people's mouth? Well, I mean, I can give you, in the case of tomato, some of the wild relatives of tomato make some really obnoxious glycoalkaloid compounds. They don't taste good, and they're not good for you. I can breed those things into tomato and make a tomato that is not very healthy for you, and it would be completely unregulated. And there are things in green tomatoes that are not good to eat. They go away when the fruit ripen or they're cooked. Those same compounds, the glycoalkaloids, I could put all the glycoalkaloid I wanted into a tomato using traditional breeding, and nobody could say anything about it, and it could kill you. I mean, it wouldn't kill you; it would just make
wouldn't
you
be good for
sick.
you, yeah.
Except in breeding, in traditional breeding, the idea is you're not doing it. The breeder is not doing it. It's nature that's doing it, and we select
That's right.
what nature's
Right.
done. That's
Right.
the critical scientific difference.
Right. I think there have to be regulatory processes. I think we have to look at every product we make, even with genome editing, and make sure we haven't screwed something up. But I think that the public has an easier time with stuff that, oh yeah, there's a natural equivalent of this out there already. I'm not doing anything weird. But to me, the height of hypocrisy is the BT gene, where, you know, well, first of all, I think there's, hopefully I do offend some of your listeners. You know, there's this misnomer that organic is chemical free, and that couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, I can spray a field until it's blue with copper, and that's considered organic. I can spray the bacterium that contains the BT. You know, there's only a few differences in the genes between Bacillus thuringiensis and Bacillus, what's the toxic one? Can't remember the name of it. I can spray Bacillus thuringiensis all over your plant, and that's organic. But I take the single gene that has the protein that kills botulism. That's what I was going to say. No, not botulism. Never mind. I can take a single gene out of that organism, put it in the plant, and suddenly that's evil, and it's not organic. I think we'd be going a long way if organic does not necessarily equal sustainable. I mean, to me, the definition of sustainable does not equal organic. And I think that the organic farmers would be a lot better off if they would drop the commercial hype. You know, organic, a large part of organic, the reason that organic was defined as being GMO free was so that they would capture that group of people who didn't want GMOs. And that to me is hypocritical. You know, I think we can, if we used certain GMOs in combination with organic practices, we would be a lot better off.
Using organic methods to get high yields is going to be, in many cases, worse, like less sustainable long term, right? Is the message of what you're saying, right? You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You could make organic a lot more sustainable if you incorporated certain parts of GMO into it, and they won't do it. It's purely marketing.
And the conflation is people will conflate organic with some kind of quality factor, that because it's organic, I ought to be able to taste it, feel it, smell it. There's something quality-wise that's different, and that's not.
It's not true
either.
It's not true.
So there's one of the things I think to really try to understand with this is sort of, you know, people care about things and they care about important things, right? And people from the scientific community can be very like, wow, right, organic actually can be way worse in all these different ways, right? Sort of the conversation is a really hard one, right? To sort of connect up the, like, what do you care about? And look, not get people defensive either, right? We can offend some of our listeners, but there's a reason, there's something people care about when they say, oh, I want organic food, right?
Sure.
And the key is to then say, right, how do we pick up on that and talk about how to actually achieve these things?
Right.
And it's not necessarily with this particular label, especially if it's come from, you know, big you know, farming practices, right?
Is it better to, if I live on the East Coast, is it better to eat something that was grown locally, non-organically, or to buy an organic product that was grown in an industrial farm in
that's a great
Salinas
question,
and
right?
driven across country?
Right.
I think I just read an article yesterday about the efforts to ban plastic bags in supermarkets. Mm-hmm. And someone actually did a study to show that in terms of in the environment, actually the plastic bags are less destructive than using paper bags.
In terms of effect on climate, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
So I think,
but then, yeah. So now this is a trade-off, then, right? You know,
it's a
sort of
trade-off.
what's your effect on the climate in terms of greenhouse gases versus right? How can we? There is an issue with the plastic and the
Precisely.
seeds, right? Yeah,
Precisely. I think in the end, a big problem that I have is people don't trust the government. And, all of this stuff with the Roundup and the things about it causing cancer, this is complete crap. People need to ask, people don't even know what questions to ask is the problem. And I think you have to look at agriculture in a much different way than we are today. And it's not just as simple as everybody grow organic, because if everybody switched to organic, we're not going to be able to feed the people on the planet.
No, you'd lose yield for one thing.
People are going to starve to death if we switch to organic. There's nothing wrong with organic. It's an admirable goal, but I think there are trade-offs. And to say, I'm doing the right thing by eating organic is not necessarily true. And there are ways to improve it. We need to pay attention. The fact is, the Gulf of Mexico is being polluted by nitrogen runoff that runs down the Missouri and Mississippi River. That's very real. And it's a bad thing. But can we just eliminate nitrogen fertilizers? Not if we want to feed everybody on the planet. So we need to have a discussion. We need to say, what are the priorities? And I think that the organic people raise important questions about how we should be doing agriculture, but they don't have all the answers.
Is it possible that the degree to which consumers will accept measures that are taken to address problems is sort of related to the severity of it? And I'm thinking of the wine industry, when all the vines were being wiped out, and what they found was a pretty nasty set of inorganic chemicals that were good at it. And I'm not sure that if people were faced with that today, they would say, okay, that's all right, go ahead and spray was it copper sulfate, I think.
Yeah. Copper sulfates can be used organically.
Yeah, there's some irony to that.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's an inorganic compound that can be used organically.
That's right, because it's natural.
Well, I think part of it is understanding on both sides, right? The consumer and the scientist, that really everybody in the end is working towards the same goal, right? Of having a healthy, sustainable, even though it's a loaded term, food supply. And
that's right.
There aren't these evil people necessarily out there, although there are some bad actors that are, trying to, manipulate the food system, right? I mean, like you said, when you were working at Monsanto back earlier in your career, the scientists there had good intentions, right?
Absolutely.
It's not this evil empire. And the people who are trying to, grow organic food or purchase organic food are trying to do it because they're trying to do the right thing, right? So it's describing good intent to the majority of people, and then how can we work together as scientists and consumers to make progress, right?
So, yeah, one of the things we have to recognize, though, is sort of there isn't any one goal, right? I mean, so I think that's another trap we can fall into. Oh, we're all trying to accomplish the same thing. No, I mean, there's trade-offs, like even about effects of the climate we just talked about, right? Sort of, greenhouse gases versus pollution, right? Nitrogen runoff versus feeding, and there's no single goal here at all, right? And then everybody's got their own interests, of course, right? If you're a grower, right, it's you care about the economics of your own family, for example, right? And these things do not always, they can't all be achieved at the same time. This is the fact of living in a society, right? And also, like, what are the different goals? I mean, I think we're hearing about sort of a lot of the different ways, and they're trade-offs, and that's even harder, right, than what you just said, right?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I don't think that you're never going to satisfy everybody, right? But I think, having the cheapest, most nutritious, abundant food supply overall, that's sort of a panacea, right? It's not.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen. Because like you said, there are people who are going to buy that cheap tomato regardless, because they don't value the $3 tomato over the $1 tomato.
That's right.
So maybe there isn't one single answer. That's a good point. Well, we want to be respectful of your time. We know you have a busy schedule. We really appreciate you taking close to an hour to talk to us. If there were people listening who want to get involved with your tomato program, what would be the best way for them to get in touch?
Oh, you can just Google me and tomatoes, and you'll probably get to our webpage.
And we'll put some links up on the website.
We'll link to your lab webpage for sure.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close things out?
I think you what you said at the end is very important to me. We're all in this together, and I think we've become a very polarized society, and what we see with the federal government today is very similar in science. This is the same phenomenon as vaccinations. There's some bad information out there, and there's some very polarizing people, and I don't know what the answers are, but we've got to try and bridge the gaps.
This has been a great conversation.
Yes, thanks for the time
Thanks
and
so
the
much.
expertise.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, Harry.
Okay.
If you have any questions or comments you'd like to share, drop us an email or check out our website at kstate.edu/research/global food. Something to Chew On is produced by the Office of Research Development at Kansas State University.